On behalf of the University of California at Santa Barbara Arts and Lectures program, I'd like to welcome you and also viewers of C-SPAN to this evening's lecture by Deborah Tannen. During the question and answer period, please use the microphones in front of the auditorium and be sure to state your name and affiliation. Afterwards, there will be a book signing on stage immediately following the question and answer period. My name is Judith Schoenholz-Reed. I'm a psychologist and an associate dean at the Fielding Institute in the doctoral program in clinical psychology. Deborah Tannen is an extraordinary linguist who examines our words, our conversations, as we individually construct them, creating worlds that separate or join. She received her master's degree in English from Wayne State University and taught remedial writing for several years before returning to graduate school at UC Berkeley to complete a doctorate in linguistics. She is a university professor and a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. You Just Don't Understand Women and Men in Conversation, her 11th book, was a smashing success and on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 years. It sold 2 million copies and it has been translated into 25 languages. When I learned that I was to introduce Dr. Tannen, I retrieved my worn copy from my shelves, having used it many times with my students. And in it I found a note from a friend who wrote, "Thank you, Judith. This book tells me about experiences I have had, but could not put into words." Deborah Tannen has the gift to take what we say and give meaning to our need to make contact with each other, only to find that we may have created impasses. Tonight, she will tell us about her latest work, The Argument Culture, Stopping America's War of Words. And it's my greatest pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Deborah Tannen.
Thank you very much. What a great pleasure to be here. I did hear 2 colleges mentioned I had been to, so I feel like I ought to. I know some of my classmates from my undergraduate training are here, so I just wanted to say I got my BA at Harper College in Binghamton, New York, and a master's at Wayne State, and then, of course, a master's and PhD here in California at Berkeley. I'm going to start by just telling you an anecdote that something that happened to me when I was on tour with the book You Just Didn't Understand that kind of encapsulates what I have in mind when I say the argument culture. I was invited on a television talk show, and it was in California, but it was in the San Francisco area. It was a show called People Are Talking, maybe some of you know it. I was invited to be on this show, and I was told that they were going to invite a man to represent the other side. And I wondered exactly what would be the other side, since You Just Didn't Understand was about women's and men's conversational styles. But I didn't see any problem with that. I had recently been on a platform with Robert Bly, and We got along quite fine, so I didn't see any problem. Well, I got to the show, and I encountered in the room waiting to go on a man he had a shirt and tie and a floor-length skirt. He had waist-length red hair, and I want to say right here, I have nothing against cross-dressers. That's not the problem, but that I think it was part of what he was doing, which was trying to be provocative. Before we went on the air, he was very polite to me. He said, "I read You Just Didn't Understand. I liked it very much. But when I get out there, I'm going to attack you. Don't take it personally." And this is the ethic behind what I'm going to be calling the argument culture. You're not supposed to take it personally, just a game. He said, "That's why they invite me on, so that's what I'm going to do." And sure enough, when I got on the show, the format of the show was quite typical of talk shows. They had a studio audience, and they had him, and they had me, and they also had guests, just kind of average people that they had invited on to talk about their own lives. So we got on the show, and I said a couple things, and he immediately leapt out of his seat practically, and he attacked me. But then he quickly moved on and delivered what was clearly a pre-planned diatribe against women. Obviously, he had done this on other shows. But the amazing thing to me, and what has stuck in my mind, is the effect that it had on the studio audience. I had been on many shows like that where women, and often it was couples, came on and talked about problems they had in their own lives. And the thing about that is made those shows so powerful, and Oprah, I think, really saw this possibility in this format and really developed it, was the connections that were established between the guests who came on and talked about their experience, and then people in the audience would say, "Yeah, the same thing happened to me," and then so they would feel connected to Oprah and to the guests and to the studio audience, and it's kind of a sense of not being alone in the world would be created. What happened on this show was very different. When the women who had been invited on to talk about problems they had communicating in their lives talked about frustrations with their husbands, the studio audience turned vicious and began accusing them of all the evil motives that this man had just described about women. And they said things like, "You don't deserve him. He should leave you and find someone who appreciates him." And of course I was appalled at the time, but as it stayed with me, as I thought about it, this has two of the key elements that I have in mind when I talk about the argument culture. The connection, the sense of connection that is normally created in a show like that between the audience and the people was broken. And rather than that connection, what was set up was a feeling of superiority. You're rotten, people in the audience obviously think, "You're rotten, we're much better." And there may be a short-term sense of satisfaction to feel superior to the people that you read about and the people that you see on television, but the long-term effect, I believe, is very undermining. It's the term that I often come back to. It's a kind of corrosive effect on the human spirit to feel that you're in a world in which everybody is your enemy, an adversarial spirit, the people that you're encountering in your life. So that was one thing. The sense of connection was broken. The other thing about that makes it what I'm calling the argument culture is that it was all a game. This man didn't really not like my book. He liked my book. He didn't believe what he was saying. It was just a show, a spectacle that he was taking part in, a kind of a show business type thing. That's what they invite me on for, so that's what I'm going to do. When people hear the title of this book, The Argument Culture, they think what I'm saying is, well, let's stop arguing and all be nice to each other. But that's not what it is at all. What it is let's stop having the phony, trumped up, acted out, meaningless arguments so that we can have the real ones. And because they had that kind of a show, there was no forum on that show to really discuss the ideas in the book. If they if they had been able to say they invited someone who had done research similar to mine and came to different conclusions, then we could have a real argument. But that isn't what we're having now. What we're having are knee-jerk, automatic spectacle arguments, and that is getting in the way of really exploring ideas and coming to any kind of solution. So that kind of captures some of it. The way I would define the argument culture is approaching everything in the world in an adversarial frame of mind, where we stage everything as a metaphorical battle. And it grows out of a belief that goes very deep in Western culture in general and American culture in particular, that opposition is the path to truth. So the best way to explore an idea is to set up a debate. You get two polar opposite views, as opposite as possible, let them slug it out in public, and then see who wins. The best way to cover news, then, is to find spokespeople for, again, the most polarized views, invite them on, and hope that they have a fight, and be very disappointed if they fail to fight. The best way to settle disputes is litigation. Two lawyers, each one represents one side. They fight it out and they see who wins. The best way to begin an essay is to attack someone. And the best way to show you're really thinking is to criticize. And there are many other elements I could talk about too, but this is kind of captures the general idea of what I'm saying when I say the argument culture. What made me first think about it this way? Shortly after You Just Don't Understand was published, well, not shortly, maybe about a year after it was published, I read an article that I felt really misrepresented what I had written in order to attack me. And through an intermediary, I put it to the person who had written this, why did she feel that she had to make me wrong in order to say what she had to say? And the answer came back, the person who had asked her said to me, well, I asked her, and she said, well, it's an argument. And something really clicked when I heard that. And I thought, that's right. Our public discourse is becoming like having an argument rather than making an argument. And you know the experience when you're having an argument with somebody that you're close to. You're not listening to what they're saying in order to understand their point of view. When you're calm, you might do that, but when you're having an argument, that's not what you're doing. You're listening so that you can hear the weakest thing. If they say something that you know has some truth to it, you put that aside and ignore it. And when they say something that is so outrageous and off the wall that you know you can really argue against that, that's what you seize on, because you want to win the argument. Well, I don't think we can avoid having arguments like that in our personal lives with people we're close to, but is it useful in our public lives to turn public discourse into having arguments rather than making arguments? So that's what really got me thinking about that distinction. And it's the same thing that happens in a debate. And we tend to use the word debate as synonymous really with discussion. Let's have open debate on the subject. Of course, that's good. But debate in the sense of a spectacle, a formal debate, one person represents each side. They don't necessarily believe it. In debating, you just argue the side that you're given. And if the other person says something that you know has some truth to it, you never concede that, you never listen to it, because you want to win the debate. So you only want to focus on the points that will support your side and ignore any points that would support their side. And when it's all over, you decide who won the debate, rather than which ideas are probably right and which ideas are probably wrong. And when you set things up as a polarized debate in that way, you don't explore the nuances in between. We've moved in a way from, so part of what I'm calling the argument culture is this setting everything up as a metaphorical battle, approaching everything as if it were a war. And you hear the war metaphors. We talk in war metaphors. Maybe in a sense what I'm getting at here, it's similar to, it's different from other books I've written in that it's about public discourse mostly. not entirely, but mostly about public discourse rather than our private conversations. But it's quite similar in a way, because what I'm trying to focus on is the power of language, the power of words, to shape how we conceptualize things and therefore how we act on things. So that so often when we think we're using language, actually language is using us. And in this spirit, the fact that we talk so much in war metaphors, you know, if you pick up a newspaper, all the headlines will be the battle, the war on drugs, the battle against cancer. People have had a 2-year battle against whatever the problem is in that community. Using war metaphors makes us think about things as if they were war, and then that limits what we think we can do about it. Another side of it is what I call an ethic of aggression, where we've come to value aggression and devalue conciliation. We've moved from biography to demonography. When people's lives are written about, as often as not, the person writing is looking for terrible things to say because there's a feeling that that's really, people don't like to read that. In the same spirit, I think, as what I was describing about that television show, that, you know, it makes you feel so good, you to feel so superior to everybody in public life when you constantly expose their weaknesses. But again, I think the cumulative effect is not ennobling. Not to say that we should hide bad things about people, but when you only write the bad side, when you're actually looking for it, writing demonography, I think it has that undermining effect where everybody begins to feel insecure and under attack. I want to make it clear, and I'm going to say this over and over, I'm not against opposition, I'm not against public expression of conflict. In a democracy, that's the wonderful thing about a democracy, that we can have open expression of conflict. But and in fact, there's actually a line that I quote, and it's by a Yugoslavian-born poet, and I think it's not a coincidence that he's Yugoslavian who said this, because people that have lived under regimes where you are not allowed to express disagreement openly realize how important this is. But I'll just quote Charles Simic, this Yugoslavian poet, Yugoslavian-born poet. There are moments in life, he writes, when true invective is called for, when it becomes an absolute necessity out of a deep sense of justice to denounce, mock, vituperate, lash out in the strongest possible language. And I quote that approvingly because I want to make it so clear that what I'm trying to say is not we should stop arguing and stop having conflict, but rather we have to have constructive ways of expressing and working out conflicts. And what I want to move away from, what I'm hoping we could move away from, is the ritualized set up fights that are not real fights at all and not real conflict at all, but a kind of show. So in that sense, it's not a book about civility. Civility, to me, suggests a kind of almost pinky in the air kind of politeness, like that you spread thin, like spreading jelly on a piece of bread. So I'm trying to look at something much deeper and ask how our tendency to conceptualize things as metaphorical battles and our commitment to the idea of opposition and of everything having two sides is undermining our search for solutions to our problems and our relationships with each other. What it really comes down to, the reason it matters, is what it does to our relationships to each other. And I believe that the adversarial spirit does infect our way of approaching each other in our everyday lives. There's a lot of talk about road rage. There's also air rage. Not long ago, I was on an airplane. I put my seat back, and the man in the seat behind me began screaming at me. And I've since heard met other people that have had the same experience. You know, the likelihood that your encounters with people are going to be vituperative has gone way up. And I think it has to do with this idea, this spirit, this adversarial spirit. I mean, man who started yelling at me clearly thought I was a villain that had said that the reason I put my seat back was in order to invade his space, rather than having something to do with me and not realizing what the effect it was going to have on him. What I want to do today is talk about these tendencies in law, politics, the press, and education, and how they're intertwined with each other. And just say a little bit about what we can learn from other cultures. Not that we're going to become Japanese or Chinese or Malaysian or some other culture, but just what you can learn from how other cultures approach conflict. The book itself has many other things. Obviously, I have chapters on technology, on gender, and you can ask me in the question period if you want to hear about that. I know some people like the chapter on gender best, but what I want to talk about tonight is law, politics, press, and education, and how they're all related to each other. And in all these areas, what I want to try to do is talk about how, yes, the concept of opposition and two sides is basic in all these areas, has had many positive aspects, but that in recent years it's gotten out of control and has become destructive. I'll start with the press. It's a funny thing, you know, the first draft of this book, I put the chapter on journalism and the press at the end. And one reason for doing that was I didn't want it to sound like the media. You know, people say the media, it's like a dirty word, like the media is, you know, responsible. I wanted to show that what we see in the media is a part of a much larger force and phenomenon. And I'm sure another reason I wanted to put them at the end was so that they wouldn't all get mad at me and attack me. But the editors understandably said, well, the press is what people really see in their everyday lives, so move it up front. So I did. So I'll start here tonight also with the press. There are really two aspects of this. One is the idea that there are two sides to every question, no more, no less, and the other is this ethic of aggression. To us, it seems like the essence of open-mindedness and expansive thinking to accept that there are two sides to every question. And we say this in our conversations, you know, as if it were self-evident. Well, you know, there are two sides to every question, and then there's the other side. What about the other side? And yet most issues don't have two sides. Most issues are a crystal of many sides. And some issues have only one side. One of the most dramatic examples of this, people who deny that the Holocaust ever happened have had more success in the United States than any other country. Why is this? They've been able to exploit our obsession with the idea that everything must have two sides. A woman named Deborah Lipstadt wrote a book exposing the tactics of the deniers, and when her book was published, she was invited to appear on television only if she would allow them to also invite Holocaust deniers on and she would debate them. She refused. She said she didn't want her book to become an excuse for giving airtime, national airtime, to people who are spreading these lies. And the producer in one case said to her, well, don't you think people have a right to hear the other side? And this is exactly how deniers have been so successful in this country, and they have, because they've been able to masquerade as the other side in a debate. And the reason this has been so successful in this country is because we are so devoted to the idea that everything must have two sides. Well, that's an example of something that has only one side. Most issues have many sides, but when television shows, interviews, any kind of discussion shows fit everything into a format of, okay, we'll have a Democrat and a Republican, a conservative and a liberal. What passes for liberal in this country is not what would be called liberal in most countries, but you know, one on each side. And those define the debate. And so anyone, and people who, like me, are often invited on those shows, know that if they invite you on a show and you really would just as soon not go on, you say, well, it's kind of complicated. You know, I can see several sides to this. They don't want you. They want someone who's going to take an extreme view and fight with the person who has the other view. Since I've written this, many people have come up to me and told me about experiences they've had where they're on a show and someone is invited to fight them and they end up agreeing, and the producers become apoplectic. You have to stop agreeing. We invited you to fight with each other. It takes a different form in the print media. In the print media, you see there's a devotion to what is called balance. And it's very interesting because obviously it's a good thing to be balanced, but sometimes often what happens is that the journalist will feel if I find somebody that says something, I must find somebody that says the opposite. And sometimes it means you have to scour the fringes of lunacy to find someone who will say the opposite. But you have to, because if you didn't, your story is going to be one-sided and you won't have had balance. Now, one problem with this is that it creates a moral equivalence where both sides have the same weight. Often they neglect to tell you the background. So for an example would be global warming, where there are several researchers whose research was funded by the fossil fuel industry, who say we don't have to worry, there's no such thing. And they are a minority within the world of science, but they are there, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be represented, but it would be reasonable to put it in context and say who funded the research and say that they represent 5 or 10% of the field rather than, but it isn't. It's simply said, this is one side, this is the other side, and it ends up distorting. So this is the problem with, very briefly, with the two sides in the press. What about the ethic of aggression? The most dramatic example of this that I've encountered, or what the background is first, there has developed, and I believe that's very much the influence of Watergate. Larry Sabato is a political scientist who has put it this way, that before Watergate, the press was like a lapdog. They just took whatever the government handed out without really questioning. And then after Watergate, they gradually became like watchdogs, but now the press has become like an attack dog. So they are attacking everybody in public life all the time. And he makes the point, it's like they're nipping at the heels of people in public life. And the feeling among journalists is that they are afraid to write positive pieces, because if you write something positive, your colleagues will accuse you of rolling over. And so a lot of it is being seen as aggressive by your colleagues. And it's interesting, this is, I came across this in reading what journalists have said about their own profession, about each other. So it's a kind of an ethic of aggression where you have to appear tough. And people say, well, let's give it an edge and let's have attitude. And that means attack, criticizing and attacking. Robert Gallo was the American researcher who did some of the original work on the AIDS virus. He was the one who identified he along with a French researcher, they had not working together, but had each been working separately to identify the AIDS virus. And it was Gallo who developed the test for AIDS, the AIDS virus in blood. And so it was the first thing we had that really began saving people's lives in this terrible epidemic. Somebody wrote an article about Gallo, it goes back 3 or 4 years now, in which he was doing what we do now, demonography, try to find negative things to say about him. So the journalist went around and asked all the people he could find, didn't they have anything negative to say about Gallo? Well, it turns out Gallo is kind of an ambitious character and, kind of a prickly character, and people had a lot of negative things to say about him. And there was this kind of a controversy going on because the virus that he had in his lab and the virus that the French lab had were too similar. And there was a lot of people wondering, how did that happen? And somebody said, well, Gallo is such an ambitious person, I wouldn't put it past him to have even stolen that virus. Well, because of this article, suspicions were raised that maybe Gallo had stolen the virus from the French researcher. Investigations began. NIH started very detailed investigations of his research. And then we have Congress gets in the act, and Representative Dingell started an investigation about Gallo. Gallo spent 4 years of his life fighting the investigation rather than fighting AIDS. At the end of the 4 years, they discovered he had done nothing wrong. Sometime along the way, about 2 years into it, he and his French colleagues figured out how this had happened, and it had something to do with samples they had sent back and forth, and they figured out how the virus and it turned out so soon. But that didn't affect anything, because the investigations took on a life of their own, as investigations do, as we know. But this is happening in so many other places, in addition to politics and the president and people holding political office. It's happening. There are many cases of this in the scientific community as well. So the and you know what? Have you ever been audited by the IRS? You know, 4 years down the line, they found Gallo had done nothing wrong. So that's great, right? Yeah, except that he spent 4 years that he could have been finding a cure for AIDS, digging up papers, you know, and you have to produce this paper and you have to produce that paper. It took all his time, digging up all the documents they were asking for, trying to reconstruct, you know, what he had done and what he had been thinking 10 years ago when this other thing happened. I mean, the story has a happy ending in the sense that he was exonerated and he now is working again and has his own lab in Baltimore. But it's not a happy ending because of the destruction that was done. And it all started with an article. This is how the argument culture, all these institutions feed off each other. It started by an article that was written by a journalist who had nothing against Gallo, but was just trying to write a snappy article with an edge that was going to show the negative side, because that's probably what his editors wanted. That's what people like to read now. And I don't believe people like to read it, but it's what journalists think people like to read. And so once it was out there in the article, and to me this is the argument culture aspect of it, that it's not motivated by some real suspicion. Obviously, investigative journalism is so important. You know, if a journalist gets wind of wrongdoing somewhere, what a great service he can perform by going out and investigating that and finding out. But this didn't happen because of a suspicion of wrongdoing. It was the requirement of the discourse. This is the kind of discourse we need, so let's push everything into that mold. And that's what he was doing. So a journalist wrote the article that cast suspicion, and once suspicion was out, the scientific community had to investigate, and the Congress had to investigate, and a 4-year investigation was the result. Attack needs no justification now in our culture. It's support that needs justification. The press and politics work together, and the example I just gave is one. Another one, some of you may remember this, in 1994, Bobby Ray Inman was nominated as Secretary of Defense, and any of you remember this event? He withdrew his name from nomination shortly after it was put forward, even though there was no question about his being confirmed. Everybody agreed he was going to be confirmed. That wasn't in question. He held a press conference explaining why he was withdrawing, and I remember it very clearly because I listened to the whole press conference, and I remember thinking at the time, this is so great. He's saying all these important things, and now people are really going to listen and change. Ha. What he said was, he had held public office in both Republican and Democratic administrations, so this was a nonpartisan thing. And in the past, he had had a confirmation hearing. It took about 2 hours. Nothing, hadn't done anything wrong, so he was confirmed. Now, he found everything was different. First of all, journalists were rooting around, trying to find things he had done wrong to write about. He says that he talked to one journalist and said, "Are you also going to write about the good things I've done?" And he says that the journalist said to him, "I'm just writing the kind of story my editor wants." Right? I'm just doing my job club. And he said that he was told by his friends in the Senate Now, don't worry, we have to make it hard for you during the confirmation hearings, but don't worry, you'll be confirmed. And it interested me because, first of all, he was in a position to know that things had changed because he had been through this in the past. But what he said in his press conference was, in order to accept an office like this, it's public service. I have to make a great sacrifice. I have to move my family, uproot my family, move my children out of school. I take a tremendous cut in salary. But I do it in the spirit of public service. But now I'm being told I also have to put up with constant attack. Why should I do this? He said, people here in Austin, he lived in Austin, Texas, people here in Austin tell me, you'd have to be crazy to put up with that. And people in Washington are telling me, well, you should know that if you're gonna stand up for public office, that's what you have to expect. Well, he said he didn't want to, and he said, furthermore, a lot of other people are gonna feel like he does and are not gonna wanna hold public office now that it means opening yourself up to constant attack. Well, I heard him say this on the press conference, and I thought, this is so great. He's saying it, you know, people are gonna listen, they're gonna see the light. And what happened? The next day's headlines and all the stories about it, bizarre. They called what he did bizarre. And they quoted all these people saying, it's really bizarre because here was a man who knew how to play the game and thought he could play the game, so how come he couldn't take it? And there were discussions about how maybe he had psychological problems, that he couldn't take it. And he quoted somebody as saying, Bobby, you have to get thicker skin. And one quote that I really loved was by Meg Greenfield, who said, thin skin is the only kind of skin human beings come with. But then she went on to say, yeah, but you gotta just take it and go on and do your job. But that was an interesting example about how press and politics work together. So it was the negative stories in the newspaper plus the confirmation hearings that were gonna have to be really tough. He decided, and it was the ritual nature, again, it's the ritual nature of it. If there were reasons to believe that Inman had really done something wrong, of course the press should be out there investigating, but that wasn't the case. It was just a ritual, knee-jerk, automatic requirement of the discourse because of the way our culture has become. Just briefly, politics. Obviously, politics is a two-party system, and there's going to be opposition between the two parties. We have a campaign. That's a military metaphor right there. Campaign, going to oppose each other, fight each other. But then, in theory, they're going to spend a certain amount of time running the country or the government or the city or whatever they're elected to, and then you're going to have another campaign. But what we have now is the never-ending campaign. So campaign tactics have now infected the running of the government. In 1996, something unprecedented happened. 14 of the most respected, most experienced senators, both Republicans and Democrats, decided independently on their own that they were not going to seek re-election. Nothing like that had ever happened before, that huge number of senators deciding to just step down. And many of them made statements about why they were doing it, and a theme that ran through most of their statements was they simply didn't feel they could get anything done in the Senate anymore because the spirit of compromise had dried up. The way you get things done is compromise. And now compromise has become a dirty word. This ethic of aggression. So to us now, compromise sounds like giving in, being wishy-washy. And there's a lot of other evidence, constant, you read it almost every day, statements by experienced senators and congressmen about how the level of vituperation and the level of rancor and partisanship has gotten way beyond anything that has ever existed in the past. And both parties now frequently feel that they would rather that nothing got done rather than something gets done and the other party gets credit for it, because they're thinking ahead to the next election. And the same thing is affecting very significantly positions being filled. So you all probably followed this in the news too. There were many years there that no judgeships, no judges were getting confirmed. So a huge percentage of federal judgeships were being left empty because the Republican-led committee didn't want to confirm judges that were nominated by Democratic administration. That actually got solved a little bit when Chief Justice Rehnquist made a public statement that the entire justice system of the country was in danger because there were so many vacancies on the federal bench. What about the law? Again, it's an adversarial system by definition, right? You've got a conflict, so there's two sides to the conflict, and we have lawyers representing each side, and they slug it out and we see who wins. Well, there's a lot of things to say about that, and I hadn't really thought about it that much myself until I started doing research for this book. We take it for granted that the lawyers are the ones responsible for coming up with evidence on both sides. In the continental system, in France and Germany, it isn't done by lawyers, it's done by a judge or a panel of judges. That is the fact-finding side of a case. And when you think about it, what we have is lawyers responsible for bringing out the facts, but each one has a motivation to distort the facts. You know, again, like you're having a fight with somebody. You only want to bring up what supports your side, and you want to suppress, if you can, what supports the other side. And we can see problems to having judges do it, because if the judges are biased, you know, that would obviously be a problem. But it becomes really dramatic if you think of the cross-examination process. And a rape trial is perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of that. If you have a rape trial, the defense attorney's job is to try to twist things up so that you will think, so the jury will think it was consensual sex and not a rape. But that's the way you're going to get your client off. And I take the transcript of a routine cross-examination of a rape victim in a rape case that took place in the District of Columbia. And just a few examples that I can tell you, I do it in more detail in the book, but this was a gang rape. And these men, a bunch of guys had attacked this woman, dragged her in the car, taken her to an alley, and they took her, she was wearing jeans, they pulled them off, they all raped her, and then they let her go. And they gave her her jeans back. But she had money in the pocket of the jeans, which they had taken out. So she asked for the money back so she could get home, so she could get a taxi or a bus home. Well, the defense attorney used that to make it look like she was a prostitute, because he said, well, you got cash on the barrelhead, right? So you wouldn't, you didn't leave until you got money from them, redefining it so that she was a prostitute. He was doing his job. If he hadn't done that, if he hadn't done his best to do that, he would, under our system, be not serving his client well. Anyone who has gone through our justice system, many people who have been through the justice system, come out embittered. They feel they were not able to really tell their story. And especially it's that experience of being cross-examined that's the most distressing, where, again, it's the job of an attorney to make the opposing witness seem like a liar, even if you believe that they're not. That's how the system works. But when I started doing research for this, interviewing attorneys, one thing that they kept telling me is that aspects of the process that were supposed to protect the rights of both sides are now being routinely abused so that each side can simply destroy the other side. So the one with the most money can try to drag the case out as long as possible to wear down the poorer side. And something called discovery has become, is often abused. So in discovery, each side is allowed to request documents or request to depose, ask questions of witnesses that might be relevant to the case before the case goes to trial. But what we're seeing now is that this discovery process is abused so that you can wear down the other side. So one example, the Dalkon Shield litigation. This was women who were very grievously harmed by having a contraceptive device inserted. and it caused infection, and women, some died, and some became sterile and had terrible infections and medical problems. Well, the attorneys for the company that produced the Dalkon Shield deposed these women and asked the most embarrassing questions they could think of about their sex lives and about their bathroom hygiene. Ostensibly, it was relevant to the case, but the real reason, and this has been written about by lawyers, the real reason was to humiliate them so that they would back off and not press the case. Another case that's often written about in the legal journals that's actually kind of funny, that was litigation between ABC and tobacco company about when ABC had a show that accused the tobacco companies of having manipulated the nicotine level of cigarettes in order to get smokers hooked, and the tobacco company sued. There was a lot of, it's these high-stakes cases where you see this the most. And so there were, ABC was demanding huge numbers of millions of pages of documents from the cigarette company. The cigarette company said, you don't really need all these documents. They're just asking for so many millions of pages, you know, to make our lives miserable. Finally, they handed over these documents on paper that was yellow with wiggly lines in the background so that it couldn't be scanned into a computer. So you can't do anything with millions of pages of documents if you can't scan them into a computer. And furthermore, ABC lawyers accused that the paper had been chemically treated so that people who handled it got sick. Now, it was never told, it goes back and forth whether it really was the case, but that's what was claimed. And this one lawyer who's written about this said that when this became public, you know, a lot of people said, oh, how terrible, and a lot of people just wanted to know where they could get some of that smelly paper. So all of these aspects of these systems that could have constructive ends and are there for real reasons are getting abused. I think a lot of it you can trace to education. Well, not necessarily that education is the cause, but you see it in the educational system where you know, a teacher has a class read something and immediately we're asked, what's wrong with it? Let's critique it. Let's find out where it falls down. Where are all the weak spots? Now, I would never say we shouldn't do that. Of course we should do that, but the problem is when that's all we do. And someone named Peter Elbow has written about this. He said, we're always playing the doubting game. Let's assume this person is all wrong and let's find out why. He says, why don't we also play the believing game and say, supposing this person's right, what would we learn if we went with him or her down that path? Now, that's not to say you're going to end up agreeing with what the person said. It's just a mental game, just as critiquing is in a way a mental game. But why don't we also play a mental game of believing? We have so many ritualized, established ways to attack and criticize somebody that came before. We don't have the same established, ritualized ways of defending somebody that has been unfairly attacked, or of integrating. How about integrating? How about asking, let's compare these ideas. Let's look at the roots of these ideas. Maybe it sounds silly to us, but where did it grow out of? Exploring, further, you know, further investigating. There's so many other things you can do other than, and in addition to critiquing. I'm a professor myself, a teacher, so I know how satisfying it is if you can get the class debating. You know, it feels so satisfying. The noise level in itself makes you feel something great is going on. And, you know, especially if one of your colleagues is outside in the hall, you know, they're really going to say, oh, what a great class I have because there's so much noise going on in here. But often, and other teachers have written this, if you step back and ask yourself what's really being learned, you notice, first of all, it's the same few students that are always taking part in all these debates. Many other students are sitting back and not taking part, because that's the case in every field that I just mentioned. People who don't like to engage in that kind of public confrontation back off. And they don't run for office, and they don't become lawyers, and they don't become journalists or whatever the field is. If you set up the atmosphere as being adversarial, people who are not comfortable with the adversarial framework back off, drop out of graduate school because they don't like, they were drawn to the field because they have the search for knowledge, and they find instead it's this verbal battle, and they decide they don't want anything to do with that. Also, it means, again, if you're trying to win a debate or win an argument, you're not likely to concede when you hear points on the other side. And you're not likely to look for the nuances, because you don't win a debate with nuances. You win a debate with sledgehammers. So our thinking is encouraged to be less nuanced and less subtle. How do other cultures do it? Are there any differences? It's very tempting immediately to talk about Asian cultures, because as Western culture, and you can trace it all the way back to the Greeks, tends to focus on dualities, dualized oppositions as a way of approaching almost anything, an open expression of conflict. We think conflict is fun. And news shows are trying to get audiences, so you figure to get the audience, you want to have a fight because that's really fun to watch. Asian cultures have a focus on harmony. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have conflict. It doesn't mean they have harmony instead of conflict. It means they, as a culture, put emphasis on harmony as a way of managing conflict. And one of my grad students is studying talk shows in Japan, and has come up with such interesting things that are so different from what we have. First of all, Japanese talk shows never have two guests. They have 3 or more, or they have 1. There's something about the number 2 that is really given to polarized opposition. As a sort of side parallel, people have observed that when parents have 2 children, we tend to think of them as opposites. This one's shy, this one's outgoing. This one's, this one's arty, this one's not arty, interested in science. But when they have 3 or more children, they tend to think of each child as an individual. There's something about the number 2 that makes us think in oppositions. And again, gender, and maybe this is a good way as I start to wind down here, gender is a good way to end up, because that's where I started and where I really got thinking about all this. After I had written You Just Don't Understand, which was really, the whole idea was that women and men can get along better if we understand each other's styles. And so often, if I was invited to speak or an article was written about me, it would be under the rubric of the battle of the sexes, the gender wars. Well, we tend to think of gender in a very polarized way, male versus female, at war, the battle of the sexes. If you think of the Chinese yin-yang symbol, which sometimes is thought to reflect gender as well as a lot of other things, if it were Western, it would be a circle with a split down the middle and 1 black and 1 white. But it isn't. It's curved, and each one folds a little bit into the other, and each one has a little circle of the other within it. And that's how Asian cultures tend to conceptualize ideas as much more intertwined and less dualistic, and therefore less likely to be at war. One discussion that the student of mine taped was a Japanese talk show about the economy. And again, we use war metaphors for everything, and it seems second nature. A Japanese talk show that she was looking at, they were discussing the economy, and the moderator asked the guests, "What's your diagnosis for the economy?" And one person said, "Well, I think it's a digestive problem. So it's kind of like indigestion, and we need to give it a rest." And then another one said, no, I think it's much more serious than that. It's circulatory, and the heart is involved." I don't think we would ever come up with these medical metaphors to talk about things. Ours would be much more oppositional. So I think what can we do? I think there are, the first thing I always think is consciousness raising, to really think about, is this the only way to talk about things and the only way to approach things? Could there be another way? I think in personal lives, if you feel yourself demonizing the people you disagree with, it's very hard not to, especially in a climate like ours. you can just sort of stop yourself and say, well, maybe this isn't an evil person. You know, if we're nasty to somebody, we think, well, we're a nice person who was provoked. But if somebody else is nasty to us, we think, well, he's a nasty person. So maybe you could flip that and say, maybe this is a nice person who got provoked. What provoked him? Maybe it was me, maybe it was something else. And we can try to catch ourselves from thinking in terms of two sides and the other side and talk about another side or other sides. You can think of it's easy to think of what shows could do. People say to me, well, obviously shows need to be entertaining and conflict is fun. It's going to be boring if there's no conflict. People like drama. Well, yes, people like drama, but there are other kinds of drama other than conflict. How about the drama of change? Wouldn't it be dramatic to see two people with different views, give them 10 minutes of airtime and say, find some common ground? I mean, that would be pretty dramatic. I actually was listening to again on the radio, but took place in a theater, a debate. And at the end of the debate, the moderator asked, what has each of you heard that changed your mind tonight? And the audience burst into applause, and it was the most passionate applause I had heard that whole time. Unfortunately, they said nothing. Because that's the spirit of our times, that's the argument culture. But that would be drama, to see the drama of change. That's just a few things I'm saying we can do, and as I said, I've only scratched the surface. I haven't said anything about technology or gender. A lot of other topics, feel free to ask me if you like, but I guess what I'm trying to do here is a kind of consciousness raising, in a way parallel to what I've done in my books about personal relationships, that if we understand the assumptions that the driving forces behind the way we talk about things, it will help us understand the way we think about things that is also limiting what we do about things. And so often you hear people say, well, that problem can't be solved because the two sides are so far apart. So we think the problem can't be solved because we have allowed the polarized extremes to define the debate. If we didn't approach things in this polarized framework of debate, then we wouldn't see the issues as so polarized, and maybe it would be a little easier to start thinking of possible solutions. So I'm a great believer that once people understand the forces that are operating on us and shaping our lives, people are very creative about finding their own solutions. But it's when you don't think that there could be another way and we don't realize the limiting force of both the language that we use and the way we have come to approach things, we aren't as creative as we could be in finding solutions. So maybe one of the thoughts I could end with is smashing heads does not open minds. I'll stop there. Thank you. We do have time for questions, and I guess there are 2 microphones, and I think you're supposed to say who you are. And if there's anything about, affiliation, that too. We'll start here.
My name is Stu Shapiro, and I'm a retired professor emeritus, and my fields are psychology and education. I have a kind of a why question for you. Why does the drama and the ritual of aggression and argument, why does that drama sell? Is it a substitute for something? Is all this, you put it so well, as a game? What is that game substituting for? What's that about? Because it does sell, bottom line. So you could reflect on that?
Yeah, about it, why does it sell, and is it right that it does sell? It does sell to a degree, and then it doesn't. I think in a way it's like, I use this metaphor sometimes, if there's a fight outside your window, you run to the window to see what's happening. But if there's a fight outside your window every night, you shut that window and try to block it out. And I believe that is happening with the public display of conflict. Readership and viewership of news is down. Voting is down. Every year, fewer and fewer people vote. It's a big crisis in this country, a crisis for our democracy. We have the lowest voter turnout rate of any advanced democracy. So on some level, it sells, and yet it doesn't sell. Young people are not following news and information shows. When a show has high ratings, it doesn't mean a large percentage of the country is watching. It means they have a very devoted following of a small percentage. And I think that's what happens with these shows, that you get a small group of people who become addicted to it, but a larger number of people are driven away. So it doesn't totally sell. But why? What is the appeal? And this does get me a little bit to the chapter on gender. There is something very universal about using opposition and fighting as a way to accomplish things that are not literally about fighting. Sports would be a perfect example of that. A kind of a metaphorical battle and one side wins, and people like to watch that. And every culture has rituals using opposition in a ritualized way. Every culture has means of channeling aggression, and in some sense that's what it is. It's a way of channeling aggression. But I think it is, and others have written about this, and I simply cite them, and I think there's lots of evidence for it, that ritualized opposition plays a greater role in the socialization of boys than of girls, and the social lives of men than of women. So if you watch little kids at play, you will see boys play fighting. And anthropologists have found this is true in every culture of the world. One group of people did this study. 6-year-old boys in a whole range of very disparate cultures, if 6-year-old boys were left alone, they would fight. Now, some cultures didn't leave 6-year-old boys alone because they didn't want to encourage the fighting. So cultures can encourage that or they can discourage it, but it's there. Girls are much less likely to fight as a form of fun. It doesn't mean girls don't fight. Of course girls fight, but they don't set up a fight as a game. It's not their favorite game to play war, to play fight. So there does seem to be that element. And I asked myself, why is it that young boys, older boys, and men use opposition much more as a way of getting things done? And there's just so many ways. You know, you see boys want to be friends, so they pick a fight. And so you're sort of pushing, and then you're roughhousing, and then you're playing, and then you're friends. Then you try it with a girl. Okay, the boy likes the girl, so he pulls her braids and gives her a shove. She goes running away, screaming. And he thinks, where'd she go? You know, I wanted to play. That's not how girls start friendship, by picking a fight, but boys do. And you see teenage boys show their affection, you know, get each other's necks in a strangle, wrestling, and show affection by playfully punching. So there does seem to be more common to men's culture than women's, and I wondered why that is, and the answer was pretty sort of popped it into my mind. One of the themes in You Just Don't Understand is one of the things that really runs through women's and men's conversational styles is that boys and then men seem much more focused on the relative status element of interaction, whereas women seem to be focused much more on the closeness-distance dimension. We both have to think about both, right? How close are we? How distant are we? Who's up? Who's down? But women seem to focus more on, is this way of talking bringing us closer or pulling us farther apart? And men seem to focus more on, is this way of speaking putting one of us in a one-up position over the other or a one-down position? While fighting is a way that you negotiate your status. So boys' status in school, junior high, high school, and elementary school, very much fighting. The boy who can beat the other boys gets the higher status. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question. That, I think, is the appeal of that. But it does seem to appeal to men somewhat more than to women. You know, violent TV shows and movies, you'll see a lot more women saying, you know, I don't want to watch it. and men much more likely to realize it's just a movie, it's just a game. Little girls can't stand cartoons because people get smashed, you know, and boys saying, it's funny, you know, it's just, just the game. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a graduate student here, and I've watched these battles play out in the classroom for many years now, and I'm wondering, I'm just curious what you teach and how you deal with your graduate seminars or your classes in general.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I had, again, a sort of, I'll try to keep my answers a little bit less long-winded, but sort of a roundabout way of answering that. The short answer is I have my students read something, and I never start by asking what's wrong with it. I always start by asking what's useful in it. What can we use here? And then I ask them to compare this to other things we've read. And eventually I do ask what's wrong with it. And then I ask, well, why do you think that would be? Because obviously this person isn't dumb, the person who wrote this. You know, there's a tremendous arrogance in that is encouraged in students. You know, here's somebody's life work, someone who's very prominent in their field, and here, you know, inviting everybody to just rip it to shreds. So I definitely encourage that, but I encourage it much later. But just a quick answer to the sort of the gender part of it. One term I had my class work in small groups and keep journals of their interaction in the small group and their interaction in the larger group. And one of the things I was trying to deal with was when we met in a large group, I think it was a class of about 18, there were many women in the class who never spoke in the larger class, but I could see they were speaking quite a lot in the small groups. And one question I asked, then I had a questionnaire at the end of the term, and one question I asked was, how could I have run the class differently that would have made it easier for you to speak in class? And what I really had in mind was maybe these women who never talked would tell me what I could do differently to encourage them to talk. But the most interesting response I got was from a young man in the class who said, well, whenever anyone speaks in class, you always encourage them and approve of what they say. Maybe if you disagreed with us more and played devil's advocate, I would speak more. It was boring to him. He just knew if he said something, I would say something approving, so that was boring. You know, but if he knew that I was going to pick apart what he said, well, that would be a mental exercise. That would be interesting to him, so he would speak more.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. You have so many interesting ideas, and I have so many questions, but I'll just try to, I'll make one. One thing I noticed in the political debate in this country is that we have these heated debates over things like whether gays should be in the military or whether we should bomb Iraq or whether we should starve them to death, or these issues that are not really central to people's lives most of the time. And I compare, like in Europe, they had a strike that shut down several European countries over whether there should be 5 weeks paid vacation or 6 weeks paid vacation. And here we're lucky if we have 1 or 2, and it's not even on the agenda. And I just think about the fact, it seems related to what you're talking about, that we have these heated debates over things that are really peripheral to people's lives, and we never really debate the really big things that matter.
Yeah, one of my main, I guess, points that I'm trying to make is that if we are so busy having all these spectacle fights, we don't have the real ones. But what I would point to is less things like should we bomb Iraq, because that probably is interesting, important to talk about, and we probably should talk about it more. But all the scandals, impeachment, investigation, you know, special prosecutor, all the time, money and effort spent on that is really diverts us from the significant conversations that we should have. And it's I think maybe all traces to the financial pressure on the newspapers and the television outlets. There's more competition. There's now a 24-hour news cycle, so that they have to, you know, it used to be there was just the 6 o'clock news and maybe the 7 o'clock news and maybe the 10 o'clock news. And so, you know, you just repeated the same thing. And now they've got to come up with news all the time. So scandals appeal to that. The competition, so the newspapers are terrified of losing audience to the television, and the television networks are terrified of losing it to the cable networks. And So there's all that competition and pressure. And the newspapers and the television stations under more pressure to make money off the news. I mean, one point that was made by one journalist was, in a way, everything turned around with 60 Minutes, because in the past, news was a loss leader. They didn't expect to make money on the news. You know, they just put it out there. But with 60 Minutes showed you could make money off the news, and so then there was that pressure, you know, to keep the audience, and it also, I think it all comes back to people's conception of what is going to keep the readers and keep the listeners. That's that's what comes to mind. There's probably a lot more going on. This side.
Yeah, Dr. Tannen, I'm Larry Messerman. I'm a postdoc researcher in education here at UCSB. And I won't argue with what you're saying. I agree with a lot. I'm wondering if you could comment on one of the chapters you didn't talk about, and the issue of technology. Because it seems to me a lot of technologies like television are particularly conducive to melodrama and not understanding, not depth of exploration of ideas. And even new technologies like email, which I use a lot, where you don't have face-to-face interaction, but you have some kind of technological mediation, are very conducive to misunderstanding, which I experience a lot.
Yes, technology has a big role. I think television has played a very big role in focusing on the spectacle of conflict and argument. And there is something about oral performance that makes it more likely for this public display of opposition to take place as compared to print, for example. But the other thing about technology is that I think if you look at the development of technology, starting with print, and then radio, and then telephone, and then computer, internet, each one brings people further and further apart. And there's something about the anonymity of communicating with people that are not in front of you that I think ratchets up the level of hostility. Flaming on the internet is a big problem, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the person isn't there. The book that I wrote after You Just Don't Understand, before this one, Talking from 9 to 5, is about the workplace, women and men in the workplace. And I found in doing research for that book, a very large percentage of conflicts at work were sparked not by face-to-face communication, but by messages left on voicemail, messages left on answering machines, memos, where the person was not there, so you couldn't gauge the reaction that you were getting. So if you got off on a tangent that offended somebody, if they were there, you'd see it and you'd backtrack, but you didn't know, so you went on with it. The internet makes that even more possible, you know, really ratchets that up. Just to sort of, you know, to dramatize this about anonymity. If you're driving along in a car and, you know, say somebody cuts you off and you've had a bad day and you flip them the finger, and then you look over and you see it's your neighbor. You're very embarrassed. You wouldn't do that to somebody you know. It's the anonymity that makes it possible to have that level of hostility. Well, with the internet, there's more and more of that communication, and maybe in the end it comes down to the one of the fundamental elements of all this, of dehumanizing the object of your communication. You know, in war, you have to think of the people you're killing as not human. And there are many ways that we do this in wars. We dehumanize the enemy, and then you can kill them. We don't kill other people. We kill units that we don't see as people. And when you get really angry at somebody in a fight, you stop seeing them as a person, you know, temporarily. And that's what these technological advances do. They make it more and more possible to forget that you're communicating with another human being. And maybe that, you know, gets down to this issue of why it's also corrosive to the human spirit for that adversarial culture to take over. I just realized I've gone pretty far over the time I was supposed to speak, so why don't I stop here? But I will be here signing books, and if you want to come up and ask me a question or whatever, that would be great. Thank you.
However you sign.
I can sign that.
You need to do that.
This is to...
Gwen, Gwen. I mainly came up here to comment because I just recently served on a jury, and I wrote the judge a letter afterwards saying how impressed I was this time around with being on a jury where you're constantly told to weigh both sides. And
Well, a case has both sides, yeah.
but it's in reaction to being a high school teacher right now. When we have Channel 1, I don't know if you know about that, where that every day we watch about 10 minutes of news. And I find that high school students automatically respond. They react. And they don't listen. They just want to have an immediate opinion of whatever's being shown. But what's interesting to me is then when they have their pop quiz, the students all stop talking and guess at their answer. It's like this, a desire to show that they know more than the TV or something. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you see...
And so much of our culture now is encouraging people to have an instant response. You know, here's this idea, press yes, press no. Whereas democracy is about going away, thinking about it, talking to people, and considering.
Or like Newsweek's little blips of, on the way up.
That's all part of it. That's right. Up, down. Yeah.
But where do you think it's going? Because I'm frightened.
Well, I don't know. You know, that's another thing that all these experts on television are always predicting, and how do they know? I think there are some signs that there's concern in all these areas. Some signs that there's concern and that people are trying to improve it. But whether it's a loud enough voice to really change things, I don't know. I hope so. Maybe the book will help.
Well, if you're reaching a future. Some fellow gave me that and said you might find that interesting.
Thank you.
It appears in our local paper.
Great, thank you. Hello. Nilza. What's the origin of that name? Brazil.
We talk about the students that stay in the classroom, don't like to debate something. I feel myself that I don't like.
Yeah.
Yes, don't like to one thing against the other.
Yeah. A lot. It's more often women that say they don't like that. Yeah. Thank you. Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It was just wonderful to hear you speak. We're from the local college, Westmont.
Oh, great.
We graduated from there, but we've learned about you in our communication studies classes. Yes.
Who should I write this to?
Jenna, Jenna. That's fine.
Pardon?
No, she has her own. We really appreciate you spending your time to do this.
Oh,
yeah. It's nice to learn so much on a weekend evening instead of plugging into a movie and Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So you've all graduated now? What are you going to do?
I'm going to be a teacher.
Great.
I'm a drug prevention coordinator for youth.
Terrific.
And I'm program director for the local Fox affiliate.
Good, you have the power.
Yeah.
You do something about it.
It's amazing.
This is to
Adrina, Adrina.
Pretty name.
I really enjoyed the part in there about how men should expect to be interrupted kind of thing. So you gotta interrupt that really.
Don't just sit there, interrupt.
What?
I said, don't just sit there, interrupt.
Yeah, that really helped in the workplace.
Oh, good.
I heard a quotation once that reminded me of something you'd said during your lecture tonight. We judge other people by we judge ourselves by our motivations. We judge other people by what they do. I can't.
Their actions, maybe.
Their actions,
Yeah, similar.
Yeah.
We always make excuses for ourselves, but not for others.
That was a really good point, yeah.
Oh, good.
Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted to take this opportunity. I graduated here in communications where I learned about your work, and I was a fan.
Did you work with Howard Giles?
No, with Dr. Mulek. he was the one that showed me gender discourse and communication.
Great.
But my sister's a graphic designer, and we wanted to do a non-profit brochure for high school students on gender and language. And so we wanted to drop this off and have a copy of it.
Okay, great.
And that was it. And I just wanted to say that I'm such a fan of your work, and you're
great.
awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hello.
What are you working on next?
I think family communication. I think I've had it with public discourse. I'll go back to private.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Is that Korean?
Yes, it is.
Yep.
Were you thinking of language and its impact on development in the family?
Well, maybe just how we talk in families. Haven't gotten very far with it yet.
Sounds really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you for plugging
Hey.
my small Eastern alma mater.
Did she actually say I got my BA at Wayne State? No, she said no. You know, I'm deaf, so. Hello.
This is Willow, my wife Willow Young.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been hearing about you for so many years.
Well, I'm really glad we could come out here.
It wasn't one of my best performances. I talked too long.
Took too long, or anything?
Yeah.
No, I wanted more and more.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I could have gone on forever, but...
I wanted to give a summer seminar that I could come to.
This is you both?
A week, 2 weeks in Florence.
Maybe we can make it really pretty.
Do you have to flee immediately after you finish learning books?
No, I can wait a few minutes. Don't go away.
Whereas, I mean, we always consider people who build stuff pretty important.
Where were you? I didn't see you all out there.
We were at that 5 rows back on the side. We like to sit on the side to get the view across the aisle.
Where's your daughter?
She's sick. She couldn't come. She went. Willow drove her home and then
I really wanted to meet her.
Yeah. Oh well. Yeah. Here's my card and here's my daughter.
Oh, she's so pretty. She looks like you.
Actually, she looks like Tommy or like his dad.
She looks like both of you.
Yeah.
Mostly like you.
She's really long and lean, tall.
How lovely.
Much taller than me.
My father was tall and thin like me, and I got my back problems from him.
Did you?
Don't go away.
Place now.
Hi.
Hi, to Helen and Paul.
Helen and Paul. Are they selling these books here, or it's just people that brought them?
The bookstore tends to sell books for whoever's speaking.
Do they have the paperback?
I don't know that this one was in paper.
It's so funny. It's the paperback publisher that's paying for this tour.
Oh, wow, pretty funny. Well, we have a little bookshelf.
I guess they didn't get it yet.
I guess not. Thanks.
Ms. Tannen, it's a great pleasure to meet you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much. You can send it to an outstanding teacher if you really want to. You met my student.
How would I know?
Adriana from City College.
Oh, yeah.
The group sent you an email.
Oh, great.
It was a great.
Is she the one that told me I answered her email?
Yes, and she
Often
came up to me
I
after and she
don't.
says this was a completion for me because all semesters this was the first book many of them have ever read cover to cover because it's a remedial reading class at City College.
I'm so
And
glad I
8 students
answered.
tonight from City College that came in. You
great.
could just see the brain cells growing.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
She said this is completed everything. They had to do field research and they did a presentation to the class and it was great. What's so funny is that in this perverse way, there's these girlfriends I have who get closer through argument. They fight past their way of connecting.
They do. Is it verbal argument or
Yeah.
physical argument?
Verbal
argument. Yeah.
Because I went to Wellesley and it was, very academic and.
So what was the academic thing?
And that what brought you together.
Yeah. It can. It can. Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
My name's Eric. You can sign it any way you want. I was thinking, I'm a elementary teacher, and lately I've been getting into my class analyzing the pros and cons of of characters' decisions in short stories.
Oh.
And thinking of this lecture brought to mind, maybe if you have a suggestion as to a question I can ask them whether they're agreeing with the pros side or the con side, but a different question so that it can be more directed towards them finding a way to not be so polar.
Well, how about instead of, what is it about the character's decisions?
Yeah, like whether the decision was...
And the workbooks are written that way too. They say, do you agree or disagree?
Well, what if you, yeah, I mean, why not say, what do you think some of the influences were?